Michael is a professor at University of British Columbia, and he holds a Canada Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law. And he's also the co-director of the Outer Space Institute. I didn't know that there was such an institute. Interesting. He has held positions at Oxford University, St. Andrews, Duke University, and has received the Donner Prize twice for his books, International Law and the Arctic, and Who Owns Outer Space. We're, as you know, Science for Peace is organizing all these presentations. We are a voluntary organization, and we hope that people will, the ones that haven't joined us, please do. I think the times that we are going through, an organization that Science for Peace is very important and relevant. After Michael's presentations, we will have a time for questions. We also, this is a hybrid meeting, so in fact, most people are following this presentation on Zoom. And I think the floor is yours, Michael, then.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I have started my timer for 30 minutes because I want to have questions and comments and criticism and all the good stuff that comes from having people thinking together. This is my second time speaking at Science for Peace, and I still have fond memories of the first occasion. This is an important group. Thank you for all that you do. I'd also like to acknowledge that Meta Spence and Doug Roach are on Zoom. That's a great honor. They are real heroes of the peace movement in this country. So, hello Meta, hello Doug. I read in the Globe and Mail, as I was waiting for my plane in Vancouver, that Prime Minister Mark Carney has just created a new cabinet committee on security and sovereignty. So I spent the 4.5-hour flight thinking about what that committee might address. This might be a newspaper article of my own when I finished working this through. So this is all very fresh in my mind. But I want to give you a few initial thoughts as to what that committee should consider and why my view of what they consider is probably much broader than the view of the people who will actually be briefing it. So when you think about security and sovereignty, many people will immediately think of Russians and Chinese planes and ships sailing towards Canada, perhaps invading the Canadian Arctic. They will also, in the current context, be thinking about the United States, and perhaps above all, the very intense pressure from the Trump administration for Canada to increase its defense spending to 2% or even 5%, depending on which day Donald Trump is speaking. So the conversation, I imagine, will be about new armed icebreakers, new fighter jets, that there will be a desire to put anti-ballistic missile capabilities onto Canada's new warships that are being built for us in Halifax, that there will be a scaling up of technology, of the modernization of our military equipment. There's even a commitment to buy new submarines. So that's the discussion as I imagine it will start in this committee. It will be about military equipment, high-tech equipment costing hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, I think those are important discussions to have. I've done a lot of work on defense procurement over the years. I'm not actually a fully committed peacenik. But I do want to challenge that framing that I've heard over the last few months and that I expect we'll hear in the months ahead. So first of all, I don't think this conversation within the Security and Sovereignty Committee is going to be addressing climate change, which in the view of many experts is the predominant challenge to national security that we face right now. That might be dealt with by another committee, although it seems to me that the Carney government is going to downplay climate change in favor of developing Canada's natural resources. I don't think the committee is going to be addressing humanitarian crises in the global south. Even though humanitarian crises, often now driven by climate change, are generating mass migration, which many people view as a security challenge when the migrants reach our shores. And also, many people not thinking, not realizing that humanitarian crises are favorable recruiting grounds for terrorists and other bad actors, for organized crime. And we will see, I suspect, pressure to reduce Canada's overseas development assistance, much like the Keir Starmer government has recently done in the UK, taking money from development assistance and putting it into military spending, not realizing that that actually is likely to be disadvantageous to national security in the end. So I want to encourage people to think broadly about what security and sovereignty might mean in a realistic, holistic sense of things. I would like this committee to also grapple with the fact that the threats that are talked up by the Canadian military and this ecosystem of defense lobbyists and defense-funded think tanks might not be as serious or as overwhelming as is often portrayed. Let me switch here for a few minutes just to the Arctic. The Russian threat to the Canadian Arctic. Consider for a moment the fact that Russia is the largest country and uncontestably owns half of the Arctic. And a very simple question: why would Russia attack a NATO country in order to acquire more Arctic for itself? It's just an implausibility, a military invasion of the Canadian Arctic by Russia. There are many bad things that Russia could do in Canada. I'm thinking about cyber attacks, for instance, thinking about sabotage, subversion, but a military invasion by actual troops seems implausible. What about China? China has become a central actor in the integrated world economy. It has a huge hunger for natural resources, but it also depends on Western markets, international trade. And so how does China acquire natural resources in places like Africa and Latin America? Through foreign investment and trade. Sometimes with a great deal of pressure applied for favorable conditions. But China doesn't invade countries for resources. it has other ways of accessing them. And as a result, the idea that China is going to invade a NATO country in order to acquire resources that it can acquire in peaceful ways is also implausible. And let me remind you of two things here. There are Chinese-owned mines in the Canadian Arctic, operating with the full permission of the Canadian government. And if I look outside of my office window at the University of British Columbia, on any given day, I can see several dozen large cargo ships waiting to load up Canadian natural resources to take them to China. So that's a straw man of an argument to say that somehow we're facing a possible invasion by either Russia or China. So when we're talking about security and sovereignty in a place like the Canadian Arctic, well, again, cyber attacks, hacking, ransom attacks, corporate espionage, election interference. These are things that we know Russia and China engage in, and maybe that's where a big part of our focus in terms of security should go, rather than buying more big, shiny, high-tech, billion-dollar toys for the military. If you ask the Canadian forces what the primary mission is in the Arctic, the actual operational Canadian forces, they will tell you that it is search and rescue. That the capacity to move a large helicopter quickly to rescue people from a sinking ship in the Northwest Passage is a primary mission. So too is rescuing an Inuit hunter or some tourists who got stranded on an ice floe. That's the primary mission. It's also the only, quote, no-fail mission in the Canadian Armed Forces. Search and rescue. So, apart from that, in the Canadian Arctic, apart from engaging in search and rescue, being able to provide disaster relief, to engage the Canadian Rangers, our reserve units in the north, which provide essential search and rescue and surveillance for hundreds of kilometers around Arctic communities. Apart from that, the only real Arctic mission are the radar sites, the North Warning System, which built on the old DEW line, the old distant early warning system, which exists to provide surveillance over the North Pole of incoming aircraft and missiles from Russia. And I actually support the upgrading of that radar capability. It's a major contribution to North American defense. It's a surveillance mission, and we need upgraded radar because they're growing old and because Russia is acquiring new technologies, cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, that demand a technological response. But that's it. The idea of sending naval ships to the Arctic is, to my mind, ludicrous. The ships we send to the Arctic should be painted red and white and operated by the Canadian Coast Guard and able to fulfill dozens of different missions during the same voyage, breaking ice for commercial vessels, doing resupply for Arctic communities, supporting Arctic science. Those are not naval roles, those are Coast Guard roles. I was pleased to see in the Liberal platform the idea that we should provide the Canadian Coast Guard with some security functions. And I would go so far as to support putting a light deck gun on the front of the larger Coast Guard vessels to provide that quiet authority that sometimes is needed to stop a drug smuggler from running away. But it's not a military mission. And to the degree that there needs to be a police presence, it's a constabulary presence. It's dealing with organized crime. discussion concerning the rest of Canada's security needs have focused recently on the planned purchase of F-35s. And I wrote a piece in the Globe and Mail a couple of months ago questioning whether the F-35s were a bad idea for a new reason. There were old reasons, which still are valid for not buying F-35s. But the new reason is the demonstrated unreliability of the current US government. In fact, any unreliable ally is not an ally. And we saw the US government in negotiations with Ukraine threatening to turn off coverage from SpaceX's Starlink satellite service just a couple months ago. In other words, willing to turn off access to a militarily critical technology in order to secure negotiating advantage on something else, in the case of the United States, access to critical minerals in Ukraine. So it turns out that the F-35s, which are extremely, computerized aircraft, require both computer updates and mission specific programs that are produced at 2 facilities in the United States. There's no kill switch on an F-35. You can still fly an F-35 without the updates from the United States. But the capacity of the F-35 to operate to its full functionality will become progressively limited. And so you will essentially have just a big, clunky F-16 rather than a highly computerized system of systems that is indeed the main purpose for the F-35. And so the prospect of a US government.
They're asking people there if you can come close to
the microphone. The possibility that we could be buying a fighter jet that we would not be able to use to its full functionality at the whim of a US president is, to my mind, an absolute veto on proceeding with the purchase. And although this is a difficult pill for people to swallow, especially in the Canadian military, which has worked so hard to get these F-35s for almost 20 years now, it strikes me as necessary. Now, the good news is that there is an alternative aircraft readily available that was deemed acceptable at the end of a competition that was held by the Canadian government just a few years ago. And this is a Swedish plane, the Saab Gripen E. So if we felt that we needed new fighter jets, there is an acceptable plan that cannot be turned off by Donald Trump. So I'd like to see that procurement reopened and the F-35 ruled unacceptable, which leads to one result. But the other thing I want to suggest at this point too is, and here I'm going to agree with Elon Musk for the first time in several years, is that the age of the crewed fighter jet, piloted fighter jet, is just about over. We have seen advancements in the use of drones in Ukraine that were difficult to imagine just a year or two ago. Not just in the air, but also at sea. The Ukrainian military has opened up the Black Sea to commercial traffic using essentially Zodiacs with outboard motors on them, an optical unit, on the front, most of them made in Hamilton by a company called Westcam. A Starlink satellite terminal, thank you, Elon Musk, and 350 kilograms of high explosives. And they go hunting Russian warships with a unit that only costs $20,000. And they've been highly effective in doing this. Now, I'm not a supporter of countries blowing up each other's ships normally, but I give you this example simply to point out that that legacy sort of systems, piloted fighter jets, billion-dollar warships, might be somewhat time limited. And in the case of the fighter jets, perhaps to go for a fourth generation fighter jet like the Saab Gripen for the next 10 years as a transition to whatever comes next, rather than putting all of our marbles into a hyper-expensive, very high-tech aircraft that could be limited at the whim of Donald Trump or another US president. These are the sorts of discussions I hope this committee is having, this Security and Sovereignty Committee. But I also want to, in the 10 minutes I have left, suggest that there are a few things that could be done that might please a lot of people in this room and online. First of all, the most glaring inadequacy in the Canadian Armed Forces concerns recruitment and retention. We are many thousands of people short of the force numerical goals of successive Canadian governments. People don't want to join the Canadian Forces anymore, especially those people who have high degrees of training in operating advanced computer systems and aircraft. Now, if you were to increase the size of the Canadian Forces, what kind of forces would we want to have? Well, I would want to have a readily deployable contingent, large contingent, of infantry and trucks and light armor vehicles that could do disaster relief, peacekeeping, and provide a deterrent function like Canadian troops are providing in Latvia today. In terms of a bang for our buck, having 10 or 20,000 young Canadians, yes, with rifles, but able to go and help prevent wars, or maintain peace, or provide a deterrence function, or ensure that humanitarian aid gets where it needs to get after an earthquake. We got out of UN peacekeeping 25, almost 30 years ago, and we've been badly missed. Imagine a Canadian Prime Minister saying that Canada's commitment to help stop the fighting in Gaza is to offer 5,000 Canadian peacekeepers. What if Canada made a similar commitment in Ukraine? What if we had the ability to make that promise? When we talk about Canada as having lost its stature, its influence on the world stage for a relatively small amount of money, for the cost of perhaps a fleet of F-35s, we could be back big time in a low-tech, mostly peaceful way. And then all of those new soldiers would also be available for domestic missions. Because we're in a climate crisis, disaster relief is going to be a massive requirement for the Canadian Forces in the decades ahead. Forest firefighting, dealing with the aftermath of floods. And then, when we get the next pandemic, being able to go into the old age homes to help save lives. You think about what the Canadian Forces have been asked to do in the last 5 or 10 years. They've been overstretched in their ability to do some really important things. So I hope the conversation isn't just about, are we going to get stealth fighter jets? Are we going to get missile defense capable warships? It would be nice if it was also about, how do we build up our force level and do things with these new personnel that could help out at home and rebuild Canada's stature abroad. I don't think that's going to be part of the conversation, but I sure wish that it would. I'm going to close by saying that we have to stop thinking about security as just a military thing. I've already mentioned the importance of overseas development assistance, but I'd also like to mention the essential role of diplomacy. We used to have best foreign service. We still have many extraordinary people. I'm not talking down our current diplomats, but there are not enough of them, and they are not well supported enough to have the maximum positive impact that you would want the Canadian Foreign Service to have. Because this new government's going to be looking for ways to trim budgets, to redistribute finances. And they're going to look at departments like Global Affairs Canada and say, well, how many embassies can we close? Right? Can we rely on local personnel rather than professional Canadian Foreign Service officers? They're going to forget that if you can prevent a war, you save massively on the amount you need to spend on the military. That a diplomat, pound for pound, kilogram for kilogram, is probably the best investment you can make in terms of national security. So that's just a brief oversight of some ideas as to how I think this new cabinet committee on security and sovereignty might start to think. That maybe security needs to be holistic, and maybe the threats to our sovereignty aren't as great as we thought they were, or they come in different forms. They don't involve invasions of foreign militaries, but they come through the internet, or they come through the infiltration of diasporas by bad actors, or they come through organized crime. Right? That would be a shift that would greatly annoy the senior leadership of the Canadian Forces, the defense lobby, the defense think tanks, and a heck of a lot of journalists in this country. Because we got into this different mindset. So I'm not a peacenik in the sense that I do believe we need militaries. But I think we can take this conversation about the future of the Canadian military and expand it in useful ways that serve a broader array of functions and can help make for a better world. 27 minutes. Okay, I would love to get input on this, because as I said, this is just a preliminary take on a really big set of issues. Thank you.